I was humiliated on my wedding day and fled to my aunt village, but she didn't let me stay in her house. She put me in her old bakery instead. When she came back 6 months later to sell it, she froze. I was already in my dress when my phone rang. It was Travis. I thought he was calling to say he was on his way. Maybe to tell me he couldn't wait to see me at the courthouse. Maybe to tell me how much he loved me. Instead, I answered with a smile in my voice and heard silence. Just breathing. Then, slowly, carefully, like he was trying not to break something fragile, he said, "Savannah, I can't marry you." I remember the world tilting. Like someone had taken the floor out from under me. I had spent that morning brushing powdered sugar off my sleeves, trying not to cry when Mama kept fussing over the seating chart. I had smiled at Aunt Louise who drove in from Alabama. Let my best friend Shelby twist my hair into soft curls, and tried to ignore that quiet, nervous flutter in my chest, that sense that something wasn't quite right. But even that quiet warning couldn't have prepared me for those words. "I can't marry you." The phone slipped from my hand and hit the wooden floor with a soft thud, but it might as well have been a thunderclap. The room went silent. Mama looked up from the mirror where she was adjusting her lipstick. My dad, who had come in with a fresh cup of coffee, froze mid-step. For a long second, nobody moved. Then I whispered, almost to myself, "He's not coming." "What do you mean he's not coming?" Mama blinked, then started shaking her head as if she could unhear what I just said. "That's not funny, Savannah." "Stop joking." "I'm not joking," I said. "He said he'd changed his mind." Everything after that was a blur. The hush in the room turned into noise. Plates clinking in the kitchen. Mama crying out, "What do I even tell people?" Shelby rushing toward me, her arms outstretched. But I didn't want anyone to touch me. I couldn't be consoled. I felt hollow, like someone had scooped out everything inside me and left a girl-shaped shell in a white dress and borrowed veil. I walked to the window. Outside, the folding chairs were already set. Balloons tied to the porch, railing bobbed gently in the wind. I saw my little cousin playing with flower petals in the front yard. She was wearing the pink dress we bought together just last week. The air smelled like peach pie and springtime, like everything was still normal. But nothing was normal anymore. I turned around slowly and looked at my parents. Mama was already on the phone with someone, probably my aunt, probably trying to figure out how to undo a wedding in under an hour. Daddy just stood there, looking at me the way he looked at broken fences or busted engines, like he was already thinking about how to fix it. But he couldn't fix this. "I can't stay here," I whispered. "Where would you go?" Daddy asked. "I don't know, just not here." Then, like some kind of answer from above, my phone buzzed again. It was Aunt Jolene. I picked up. "I heard," she said. No need for small talk. Her voice was calm, matter of fact. "Pack your bag, darling. Come stay with me for a while." I didn't even say goodbye. I hung up and walked out of the room, still wearing the dress. I didn't take off the veil. I didn't grab my shoes. I just walked straight out the front door into the Georgia sun, into a new life I hadn't planned for. I didn't cry until I was on the bus, face pressed against the dusty window, watching my old town fall away behind me. I didn't know it yet, but that was the beginning of everything. The bus to Willow Creek was half empty, but I took the last row anyway. I didn't want to talk. I didn't want anyone to look at me too long and start asking questions. My veil was gone, but I was still wearing the dress, crumpled and smudged from the ride, the lace snagged near my hip. I hadn't had the courage to change. It felt like the only thing holding my body together, like if I took it off, I'd unravel completely. Every bump in the road made my stomach turn. I stared out the window as we passed open fields and broken fences, tin roof houses and clotheslines swaying in the wind. Everything looked so ordinary, so heartbreakingly unaware that my entire life had just collapsed. When I finally stepped off the bus, Aunt Jolene was already waiting. Her hair was piled high on her head like always, and she wore a denim jacket over her church dress, like she couldn't decide if she was coming from Sunday service or a cattle auction. She didn't say anything when she saw me, just nodded, picked up my bag and said, "Let's get you somewhere quiet." I thought she meant her house, but we didn't drive there. We passed it, her little yellow cottage with the porch swing and the wind chimes, then turned down a gravel road that led toward the edge of town. My heart sank a little. I thought maybe she'd changed her mind. Maybe I wasn't even welcome there. Then she pulled up in front of an old brick building with vines crawling up one side and faded paint on the other. The sign above the door was chipped but still readable, "Magnolia Oven." "Wait," I said. "You're leaving me here?" She turned the engine off and looked at me. "Savannah, if I take you into my house right now, you know what the neighbors will say. They'll be knocking on my door before nightfall, wanting to know why the runaway brides camped out in my guest room. But here," she gestured toward the building. "Here, nobody will bother you." My hands were shaking when I reached for the door handle. "I don't even know how to be alone." Aunt Jolene softened a little. "Honey, You were alone the minute that man decided he didn't love you enough to show up. But being alone ain't always a curse. Sometimes it's where you find yourself again. Inside, it smelled like dust and with smoke and something else, something warm beneath all the decay. The old bakery had high ceilings and wooden beams that had turned black from years of oven heat. Sunlight filtered through cracked windows, casting golden streaks across flour-covered tables and rusted equipment. "This place hasn't been touched in years," she said, flipping on a light that flickered weakly before studying. "Used to be 10 people working here. Now it's just ghosts and old stories." She led me to a small back room with a metal-framed bed, a desk, and a shelf of yellowing cookbooks. A folded quilt sat at the foot of the mattress, smelling faintly of lavender and thyme. "I cleaned it best I could," she said, setting my bag down. "You've got electricity, running water, and a lock on the door. It ain't the Ritz, but it's safe. It's yours for as long as you need it." I stood there, taking it all in, and for the first time since the phone call, I felt something besides grief. Not hope exactly, but a flicker, a pause in the pain, a quiet. "I don't know how to thank you," I said. "You don't," she replied, already halfway out the door. "But don't go lying here in the dark feeling sorry for yourself. If you're going to stay here, you're going to do something with your hands. Clean, rearrange, paint, bake. Something." I wanted to argue, but I didn't. She was right. I didn't know who I was anymore, but I couldn't figure it out lying still. That night, I sat on the edge of the narrow bed, still in my wedding dress, and listened to the creak of the walls, the hum of silence, and the sound of my own breath filling the empty space. No one knew where I was. Not Mama, not Travis, just me and the bones of an old bakery that once fed a whole town. It should have felt lonely, but somehow it felt like the start of something real. The next morning, I woke to light streaming through the dusty windows and the distant sound of a rooster. For a few seconds, I forgot where I was. Then I saw the faded beams overhead, the chipped white paint on the walls and the suitcase by the door. And I remembered. I wasn't a bride anymore. I didn't change out of the dress until noon. I finally peeled it off and hung it in the tiny closet next to the utility aprons that had been left behind. Seeing it there, white and crumpled, surrounded by the smell of yeast and old wood, felt symbolic in a way I wasn't ready to explain. I spent the day sweeping. Dust clung to every surface like memory. I opened the windows and let the wind carry out as much of it as it could. I wiped the old counters, shook out the rugs, and took the cracked dishes down from the shelves just to give them purpose again. I didn't know why I cared, but I did. When the kitchen was clean enough to breathe in, I sat by the giant brick oven in the center of the room and ran my hand along its edge. The bricks were blackened from years of use, but solid, strong. I leaned in, breathed deeply, and caught something faint beneath the dust. A smell like warm dough and caramelizing sugar, a memory I didn't own, maybe someone else's story, lingering in the walls. "If you could talk," I whispered to the oven, "I bet you'd have a hell of a tale." That night, I went to the little general store on the corner to pick up some groceries. The bell jingled above the door as I stepped inside, and instantly I felt all eyes turn. It was a small town. I knew what they saw. An unfamiliar face. A young woman buying single portions and dish soap. And the rumors had already started. Behind the counter was a woman in her 50s with cat-eye glasses and a name tag that read Cheryl. She leaned over the register like it was a secret keeping box. "You must be Jolene's niece," she said with a smile too wide to be innocent. "Heard you're staying at the old bakery." "That's unusual." "Guess I'm unusual," I replied, trying to sound lighter than I felt. "Well, that place has got bones," she said. "People still remember the bread from there. I used to sneak a slice before school when Miss Loretta ran the ovens. Best sourdough I ever tasted." That name stuck with me. Loretta. Back at the bakery, I made a simple dinner and sat by the window as the sky darkened. The air was thick with humidity, and somewhere in the woods behind the shop, cicadas were screaming like they had something to prove. I couldn't stop thinking about that smell. About the way the oven seemed to hum when I touched it. About how good it felt to scrub a counter until it shined. Something inside me was tugging, urging me toward movement. What if I tried? The thought arrived quiet, almost ridiculous. I'd never baked anything from scratch in my life, not without a box mix or a YouTube tutorial. But something about this place made me want to learn. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was the oven. Or maybe it was because I had nothing left to lose. The next morning, I asked Aunt Jolene about Miss Loretta. She raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "I want to learn to bake." She studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "Well, you're in luck. Loretta's still around. Lives over in Birch Hollow, just 15 minutes down the highway. Don't get your hopes up, though. She's stubborn as a mule, and twice as particular. But if anyone can teach you, it's her." And just like that, the first ember of something new began to glow. Aunt Jolene's old pickup, grown the whole way to Birch Hollow. The road curved through woods and farmland until it spilled out near a weathered little cottage with green shutters and sunflowers leaning over the fence. That was where Miss Loretta lived, a woman I hadn't met, but whose name already carried the weight of cinnamon and yeast in my imagination. She answered the door before we knocked, small and wiry, with silver curls pulled back in a scarf and a pair of hands that looked like they'd wrestled dough for 40 years. Her eyes scanned me like a ledger, quick, sharp, no nonsense. "So," she said, arms crossed, "you're the runaway bride from Wayland." I flushed. I didn't think it would reach this far. "I'm Savannah," I managed. "I heard you used to bake at Magnolia Oven. I'd like to learn." Miss Loretta didn't move. She looked at me, then at Jolene, then back again. "Why?" I hesitated. I didn't know how to explain that I needed to bake, like I needed to breathe, that after being left at the altar I wasn't sure what I was anymore, but I knew I couldn't go back to who I'd been. "I just want to try," I said. "That's all." She stared a second longer, then finally stepped aside. "You got shoes that can handle flour?" That was how my apprenticeship began. The first day, she had me sweep. Not the kind of sweeping I did at the bakery. This was more like a ritual. Then we cleaned the workspace, wiped every surface, and set out the ingredients like soldiers preparing for battle. "Baking," Miss Loretta said, "ain't just mixing things together. It's rhythm, patience, feeling. Don't knows if you're lying." I laughed, nervous, unsure, but nodded. She showed me how to bloom the yeast, how warm the water should be, how to mix without bruising. The first batch was a disaster. Too wet. The second was better, but still collapsed in the pan. "Stop fighting it," she said, watching me struggle. "Let it tell you what it needs." "Dough doesn't talk," I muttered. "Oh, but it does." "Not in words. You just have to listen with your hands." I didn't sleep that night. My body ached. My fingers smelled like salt and grain, but I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Engaged. Present. Tethered to the world by something warm and rising. By the end of the week, I could knead without looking down. I knew how to shape the loaves and check their proof by touch alone. And when Miss Loretta finally let me slide one into the oven by myself, I held my breath the entire time. It came out imperfect, edges too brown, crust a little thick, but when she sliced it open and steam rolled out, she nodded once. "Not bad," she said. "Not great either," I replied. She grinned. "If it were perfect already, you wouldn't need me." We kept going. Every morning, I drove out to her cottage and worked until my arms were sore. I took notes, asked questions, messed up a dozen more times. But each failure taught me something. And slowly, almost shyly, I began baking in Magnolia Oven too. Just a few loaves a day, starting at dawn, dust floating in golden light like flour in the air. The town noticed. Cheryl from the store was my first customer. She bought a sourdough and came back 2 days later asking if I could make cinnamon rolls. A retired schoolteacher asked for honey wheat. I scribbled recipes in a notebook, made mistakes, burned 3 pans, but people kept coming. They didn't just want bread. They wanted something that felt like memory, like home. One evening, after I'd cleaned the last of the trays, I stood in the middle of that old bakery and whispered, "You still with me?" I pressed my palm to the warm brick oven. It was like it exhaled beneath my hand. That night, I wrote a sign by the door in chalk, "Open Saturday's fresh bread, made by hand." I didn't know if anyone would come, but I was finally learning how to rise. The smell of cinnamon and rising dough filled the air that morning. I had just pulled a tray of honey oat loaves from the oven when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. I wiped my hands on my apron, expecting Cheryl or one of the regulars, but when I stepped outside and saw the car, my stomach dropped. It was an old silver sedan. Scratched door, Georgia plates. I knew that car better than I wanted to admit. Travis stepped out like he was walking into familiar territory. Same slouched shoulders, same hesitant half smile, but thinner, paler, like he hadn't slept properly in weeks. "Hey, Savannah," he said, eyes scanning the front of Magnolia Oven like he didn't recognize who I'd become. "Travis," I replied, flat as a cutting board. I didn't invite him inside. I was just passing through. He lied. "Right." He glanced down the road, then back at me. "I've been here before," he admitted quietly, eyes fixed on the gravel. "A month ago, I parked across the street and watched people line up for your bread. I almost came in, but I didn't know what to say. I didn't answer, because there was nothing left to say." He stood there, hands in his pockets, shifting from one foot to the other like a boy waiting to be scolded. "Can we talk?" he asked. "You're already doing it." He winced, but didn't back down. "I know I messed up. What I did, it was unforgivable." I leaned against the porch post and crossed my arms. "That's one word for it. I was scared," he said. Everything felt too big, too final. I panicked. You panicked an hour before our wedding, I said, and I felt my voice tremble, but not from pain, from anger held in too long. I've thought about that day every single one since, he continued, and I want to fix it, if you'll let me. Something in me almost laughed. Not cruel, just tired. I looked at him. The man I'd once imagined raising kids with, building a porch swing with, growing old beside, and all I felt was distance, like remembering someone from a dream that no longer made sense. You want to fix it? I asked softly. Tell me something, Travis. Did you fall back in love with me? Or did you just expect I'd stay frozen in time until you changed your mind? He blinked. The question hit harder than he expected. I just miss you, he said. I miss what we had. What we had, I repeated. You mean before you decided I wasn't enough to show up for? His shoulders slumped. I didn't come to fight, and I didn't come to hear apologies that changed nothing. He stood there, hands hanging useless by his sides, like he didn't know what to do with them anymore. I thought maybe we could try again. I see now. I was wrong. You're different. I nodded. I am. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was nothing left to say. When he finally turned and walked back to his car, I watched the dust trail follow him down the road. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just breathed long and deep, and felt something inside me finally loosen. I wasn't waiting anymore. When the dust finally settled, I realized I hadn't just closed the door on Travis. I had closed it on the woman who once measured her worth by someone else's promises. That version of me, the one who begged for love, for presents, for crumbs, was finally gone, and I didn't miss her. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees and cast warm amber light through the bakery windows, I took off my apron and sat at the long wooden table where I shaped the dough. The place was quiet except for the soft ticking of the wall clock and the smell of cooling bread. I reached for the drawer where I kept important papers and pulled out the business card Mason had given me weeks ago. I hadn't called him yet, not because I didn't want to, but because a part of me had been waiting to see if the past would come knocking first. Now it had, and I had answered with silence. I picked up the phone and dialed the number. He answered on the second ring. This is Mason Carter. Mason, it's Savannah. From Magnolia Oven. A pause. Then, warmly, I was wondering when I'd hear from you. I'm ready, I said. Let's talk. Mason showed up 2 days later with a leather folder under one arm and that same calm, grounded presence that had made me curious the first time we met. He walked through the doors of Magnolia Oven like he belonged there, not as a guest, not as a buyer, but as someone who respected the bones of a place and the woman who kept it alive. We sat at my dough table, now doubling as a conference desk, with a pot of tea between us and sunlight spilling across the floor. I've looked into the property records, he said, unfolding the papers. The building's owned by the county. They're willing to sell. 300,000 flat. No liens, no back taxes. Just old brick and big dreams. I let out a low whistle. That's a lot of zeros. Mason nodded. It is, but not impossible. I'll cover the full cost for now, he said gently. 300,000 is a lot, but I'm not investing in walls. I'm investing in you. The ownership's yours, because this place wouldn't exist without your hands. Your story. I stared at him. You'd give me 40%? He smiled. Savannah, this place already has a soul. I'm not here to take that. I'm here to help it grow. I looked down at the table where my palms had pressed dough into shape day after day. I thought about the cracked oven, the burn mark on my apron, the notebook where I scribbled every failed recipe and accidental success. None of this had come easy, and yet none of it had ever felt like a burden. You're serious, I said. Completely. I nodded slowly. Then let's do it. The week that followed felt like a storm of paperwork and county inspections. I filled out forms I didn't understand, sat through meetings about health codes and business licenses, stood in line at the bank with shaking hands. But Mason was there, every step, translating legal jargon into plain English, reassuring me when I felt small, reminding me that this wasn't just his investment. It was my story. By Friday afternoon, I held the deed in my hands. Magnolia Oven was mine. Mine in ink and law, mine in sweat and hope. That night, I stood in the middle of the bakery and let it sink in. I ran my fingers across the same counter where Miss Loretta once rolled dough, touched the bricks of the oven like they were part of my own spine. I wasn't just baking anymore. I was building something. Something that could last. The next morning, Mason picked me up early. I want you to see the stores, he said. Come meet the people who'll be selling your bread. The drive to the city was quiet, comfortable. He told me about his first shop, how it had started with a single shelf of local honey and grew into a network of markets that carried everything from heirloom tomatoes to small batch preserves. He wasn't flashy. He didn't name drop. He just believed in honest food and the people who made it. When we pulled into the parking lot of the first store, I felt nerves twist in my stomach. But inside, it wasn't what I expected. No neon lights. No corporate gray walls. Just wood shelves, baskets of fresh produce, and the scent of real food. A girl named Lena behind the counter waved and smiled. "So this is the baker?" she asked Mason. I blushed. "I'm still learning." "We all are," she said. At the second store, an older man in an apron shook my hand and said, "You bring that cinnamon bread you made last week, and I'll clear a whole shelf." At the third, a mother with 2 kids asked if I made dinner rolls. By the time we drove back, I had a notebook full of requests, names, and ideas. My head ached, but in the best way. Not from confusion, but from vision. As we reached Willow Creek, Mason slowed the truck and glanced over at me. "You did good today," he said. "Thanks." "I mean it," I smiled. "So do I." That night, I didn't feel like a woman who'd been left in a wedding dress. I felt like an owner, a creator, a woman who had taken what broke her and turned it into something that could feed the world. 6 months later, Magnolia Oven was no longer just a building. It was alive again. 3 ovens fired from dawn to dusk. The air inside constantly smelled of rising dough, sugar, and cinnamon. I had 5 employees now, 2 high school girls who helped with prep and deliveries, a retired postmaster who shaped loaves like it was a sacred ritual, and Miss Loretta, who still came in twice a week to supervise but mostly just drank tea and smiled when she thought no one noticed. We baked close to 100 loaves a day. Sourdough, honey oat, rosemary olive oil halal on Fridays. Sometimes, I'd pause while brushing butter on a fresh crust and think, this came from nothing. From heartbreak. From ashes. The town responded. People lined up on Saturday mornings before we even opened. Tourists wandered in after hearing about us from some food blogger I'd never met. Kids left sticky-fingered and smiling. It was chaos. It was beautiful. And it was mine. Mason kept his word. He didn't interfere. But he did show up. Sometimes with order forms, sometimes with new packaging ideas, sometimes with just 2 coffees and a warm "how are you holding up?" He never pushed, never asked more than I was ready to give. But he was there, always just there. And slowly, something softened in me. One night, after we'd finished a massive batch for a citywide food festival, I found him wiping down the front counter. Flour smudged his shirt, and he looked less like a businessman and more like someone who belonged. "Why do you keep showing up?" I asked. He looked at me, surprised by the question, then shrugged. "Because I believe in this place, and in you." The words hit somewhere deep. I didn't answer right away. I didn't need to. He didn't press. We just stood there, in the hush of the after-hours bakery, while the ovens cooled and the moonlight filtered through flour-dusted windows. A few days later, Miss Loretta came by for her usual afternoon visit. She eyed the new delivery rack and sniffed approvingly at the batch of buttermilk biscuits, cooling by the window. "You've built yourself something real," she said. "I couldn't have done it without you." She waved that off with a snort. I just pointed at the dough. "You were the one kneading through all the mess." Then she looked at me, serious. "And that Mason boy, he likes you." "I know. You like him." I hesitated, not because I didn't know, but because admitting it meant letting go of something I had used as armor. "Yes," I said quietly, "but it's different this time." She nodded. "It should be. Different's good." That evening, Mason stopped by after closing. He brought over 2 lemonades and news from the city. We'd been featured in a small regional magazine. Nothing huge, but enough to make people curious. Enough to prove what we were doing mattered. As we sat on the front steps of the bakery, sipping quietly, he turned to me. "Can I ask something?" "Go ahead. Are you still scared?" I thought about it. About how I used to lie awake, wondering if I'd ever feel like myself again. About the voice in my head that used to whisper, "You're only what he left behind." "No," I said. "Not anymore." He nodded slowly. Then, carefully, he reached for my hand. I didn't pull away. Inside, the ovens were silent, the bread cooling. The air smelled like flour, sweat, and something sweeter like peace. Outside, the world kept spinning. But here was mine. Some mornings, I still wake up before the alarm. Not because I have to. My staff can handle the early shift now. But because something in me wants to. There's something sacred about walking into a quiet bakery before the world stirs. The smell of cool stone, the hush of flour settling in the air, the feeling that this day, like a fresh loaf, is still being shaped. 6 months ago, I thought my life was over. Now, I understand it was just the oven preheating. One Sunday, I found myself back at the closet in the back room. The one where I had hung my wedding dress all those months ago. It was still there, pressed between aprons and flour-dusted jackets. I touched the fabric gently. It no longer made my throat tighten. It was just fabric now, just a symbol of a life I almost had and no longer wanted. I didn't cry. I smiled. That same afternoon, I walked out to the front porch and found Mason reading over delivery invoices. He looked up, squinting into the sun. "You look lighter," he said. "Maybe I am." He stood. "I've got something to show you." We drove 10 minutes outside town to a small patch of land he'd purchased, flat open and kissed by wind. "This," he said, "could be the site of our first storefront." "Our first?" I laughed. "Well, I thought we could build something bigger. A place that holds both our names. A cafe. A bakery. Maybe even a teaching kitchen." He glanced over, suddenly unsure. "If you want that." I looked out over the grass, imagining a wooden porch, fresh loaves in the window, the sound of laughter and clinking mugs. A place filled with community, not just commerce. "I want it," I said. "But only if we build it the way we built this. Slow, honest, and together." He smiled. "That's the only way I know." Back at Magnolia Oven that evening, I sat with Miss Loretta while she sipped her chamomile tea and watched a new batch of sourdough rise behind the glass. "You've come a long way, sugar," she said. "I had a good teacher." She chuckled. "You had something better. You had a reason." She was right. I hadn't baked just to forget Travis. I had baked to remember myself. To remember that I could shape something beautiful from chaos. That I could rise again. Even when everything inside me had once collapsed. Later that night, after locking up, I sat in the silence and wrote something in my journal. Travis left me in a white dress, thinking he was breaking me. But he only broke the version of me that was waiting for someone else to define her worth. What rose from those ashes wasn't a victim. It was a maker. A woman who feeds others, who leads with her hands, who creates joy from flour and fire. I am not someone's almost wife. I am Savannah Brooks, and I have a damn good oven. Weeks passed, then months, and life, real life, settled in. The kind without grand gestures or dramatic exits, just days filled with work and sweetness and small decisions made side by side. One evening, I stood at the back doorway, watching the sun dip behind the trees and felt arms wrap around my waist. "You ever think about that day?" Mason asked softly. "The one where it all fell apart?" "No," he whispered. "The one where it really began." I turned and looked at him, at the man who had walked into my story not to rescue me, but to build with me. And I said what I now knew to be true. Every day, he kissed my temple, and we stood in the doorway while the night rolled in, warm and familiar. Inside, the bakery smelled like tomorrow. And I was finally home. Sometimes, life breaks you open not to destroy you, but to let something new rise from within. Savannah wasn't saved by a man or a business deal or even a bakery. She was saved by her own hands, by the quiet work of healing, by choosing to build instead of collapse. Her story reminds us that being left behind isn't the end. It's a pause, a space. And in that space, if you dare to breathe again, to need again, to believe again, you just might find a version of yourself that's stronger, wiser, and more alive than ever before. The bread of your new life won't be handed to you. You'll have to make it flour, salt, tears, and fire. But when you taste it, you'll know it was worth every broken piece.